Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to make sure that you hear me, because there's no use talking to each other if we can't hear each other. Thank you very much, Eric, and also Bill, for inviting me here. I feel honored to be here. I've been a humanist for a long time, and a more passionate one because I was raised as a Roman Catholic. My talk is entitled A Moment of Truth. That's not in your program, because when I was asked to give it a title, I gave the subject matter that I was going to deal with. I didn't know what I would come up with. I never know when I write where I end up. It's a journey into the dark. I get onto a boat and head in what I hope is the right direction and see where it takes me. It's a little unusual for, I think, poets to be defending poetry, but I'm not the only one who's done that. And what could be more appropriate than to start an inquiry into the function of poetry at an Imagine No God conference, and with a quote from the Romantic poet Percy Shelley, who, as a student, was expelled from Oxford for writing and publishing a pamphlet entitled The Necessity of Atheism. As an adult, he married Mary Wollstonecraft, whose mother authored what is perhaps the first feminist manifesto in the world, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, in 1792. On these two counts alone, Shelley would feel quite comfortable among us humanists here. In 1821, he wrote a spirited defense of poetry in response to a witty, tongue-in-cheek attack on the poets by his friend and fellow poet Thomas Love Peacock in his essay 4 Ages of Poetry, published anonymously in 1820. Peacock takes the poets of his age of brass to task for being, quote, semi-barbarians in a civilized community, unquote, for writing, quote, as if there were no such thing in existence as mathematicians, astronomers, chemists, etc. He calls them drivellers and mountebanks who do not merit the attention of any reader. Shelley, in his response, offers a view of poetry and poets that is almost diametrically opposed. I can see Peacock and Shelley chuckling over a beer in the local pub as they contrast the dilettantes and incompetence in an art that makes the highest demands on craftsmanship with the serious, quote, poets for those who imagine and express the indestructible order of nature. For Shelley, serious poets are not only the authors of language and of music, they are also the institutors of laws and the founders of civil society and the inventors of the arts of life and the teachers who draw into a certain propinquity with the beautiful and the true that partial apprehension of the agencies of the invisible world, which is called religion. Well, Shelley's extravagant claims are not likely to find many supporters here among humanists today, who, by and large, prefer to look to scientists as those who imagine and express the indestructible order of nature. I'm going to try and demonstrate that Shelley's view of poets as the, quote, unacknowledged legislators of the world, unquote, is valid as a metaphor. So is Peacock's, scorning as drivellers and mountebanks those who betray their calling. The two viewpoints describe the perennial differences between incompetence and mastery, mediocrity and genius that characterize poets and indeed the practitioners of all the arts, even of all human endeavor. Poetry is a verbal art. As a verbal art can look back on more than 5,000 years of successful practice in the written form, and its oral form reaches beyond the Neolithic revolution 10,000 years ago. Dealing directly with human experience, poetry cannot but respond to the changing social and political circumstances in the evolution of human civilization. In our time, ironically, precisely when its contributions are most urgently needed, poetry seems to have become redundant, except as a form of entertainment. In the 21st century, poets have become an endangered species. For several years, as editor of Humanist Perspectives, I ran a feature called A Poet's Voice in every issue of the magazine, and invited poets to present their work and explain why they write poetry. In all the years we published the feature, there was never a single response to it by any of our humanist readers, though we received plenty of letters to the editor on the discursive political contents of each issue. Not surprisingly, Humanist Perspectives dropped A Poet's Voice when I resigned as editor. Humanists are not alone in this indifference to poetry. Where once poetry attracted substantial audiences eager to listen to a single poet for an hour or two, today most members of the audience are poets themselves. Poets have become their own audience, and they're lucky if they're allowed to read for more than 10 or 15 minutes at a time. And whereas readings used to take place in auditoria that provided an environment enabling a serious encounter with the subtleties and complexities of a poem, today they occur in bistros and cafes against the background of clattering dishes, the chatter of indifferent patrons, the rumble and roar of traffic outside, and often in between musical numbers of pop music played at decibels that guarantee early deafness as they beat the mind to a pulp. Fire engines and police sirens are at home in such an environment. Poems are not. All this is but the proverbial tip of the iceberg. The publication of poetry books, where the sale of 500 copies of a collection constitutes a bestseller, faces the same dilemma and confirms the rapidly declining role of poetry in our culture. This lamentable situation is one of a multitude of developments symptomatic of what cyclical historians and philosophers like Giambattista Vico, Oswald Spengler, and Arnold Toynbee have called the decline of the West. To see history as a cyclical process is merely the acknowledgement that, as a complex interactive system, civilizations are organic entities that are born and must eventually die. From the ashes rise new civilizations. Our civilization was born from the demise of antiquity and has now reached the nadir of its cycle. In a universe ruled by the law of entropy, this is the inescapable pattern of all things: nations, individuals, species, civilizations all come and go in a chain of endless transformations. We happen to be living through the demise of Western civilization, when, in the words of the poet William Butler Yeats, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Yeats wrote these lines in The Second Coming in 1919, almost 100 years ago. Yet I know of no more perspicacious description of the state of the world today. And that is not because poets are prophets, but because they face the events of their time honestly and without subterfuge, while the general public lives a century in the past. Poetry is the writing on the wall. For using the term poetry, I am using the term poetry here. I have to make sure that I can see. I'm using the term poetry here to refer to its lyrical and epic manifestations. My arguments apply with the same, but some slight modifications in other literary forms. The novel, after all, is essentially epic poetry transformed to deal with the bourgeois world. And that drama is poetry, playwrights like Sophocles and Shakespeare have amply demonstrated. But novels and plays employ different strategies involving plot and characterization. I'm going to focus on the poem as a verbal construct using rhythms, images, and tone in the imaginative employment of such literary devices as metaphor, simile, symbol, metonymy, onomatopoeia, synesthesia, and hyperbole, to evoke an experience that engages the whole of a reader or listener, his or her thoughts, emotions, memories, histories. As the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas famously put it, poetry is what in a poem makes you laugh, cry, prickle, be silent, makes your toenails twinkle, makes you want to do this or that or nothing, makes you know that you're alone in the unknown world, that your bliss and suffering is forever shared and forever all your own. What in a poem makes you laugh, cry, are words. Words carrying and juggling meanings, alluding to hidden connections and contradictions, triggering associations and conjuring images, words arranged in rhythmic patterns that resonate with memories and emotions. It all starts with words. That is why Shelley calls poets the authors of language. Poets are utterly dependent on finding and using the right word. Le mot juste is their commitment and obsession. Their laboratory is life itself, where the search for the word or phrase that most truthfully captures and communicates the complexity of experience. They do so with the same assiduous exactitude with which scientists labor to bring their theories into accord with observation. Poets are the supreme custodians and keepers of language. And since language is what makes us human, poets are the guardians of our humanity. Our fellow creatures on this planet have ways of communicating too, but their grunts, growls, and whistles have never crossed the watershed between their concern with food, fear, and fornication, and our search for understanding and meaning in the world we inhabit. In the process, humans have reached a level of communication that is providing us with knowledge and insight into the universe that is nothing short of miraculous. Remember that we are essentially walking bags filled with 10 gallons of water in which a handful of chemicals are dissolved. And here we go, telling each other how everything was born from nothing 13.7 billion years ago, how 1/1,000,000,000 of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second later, our universe was the size of an infinitesimal dot that began to inflate faster than the speed of light, and so on and so forth. These mind-blowing insights into the origins of the universe, of our planet, and the evolution of life on it are the direct result of our acquiring language, and with it, the ability to abstract, to question, to search, to think. Language is the measure of our humanity. As nations and as individuals, we are as rich or poor, true or false, base or honorable as our language. In their care and nurture of language, poets carry out the fundamental mission of words, which is to name a thing, an event, an idea, an emotion precisely and without equivocation for what it is. This mission is the foundation of civilization, and its success depends on the honesty and truthfulness with which speaker and writer use language to communicate with us. The health, happiness, and evolution of society depend on it. So you would expect humanity to be totally committed to the authentic use of language. The reality is that there has probably never been a time when language was as systematically abused, degraded, and perverted as it is today. More energy, skill, and money are employed in using words to deceive and manipulate than in their honest use. In politics, advertising, insurance, the media, religion, the legal professions, to name but the most notorious, whole armies of people derive their livelihood from abusing words to mislead, misrepresent, misinform, distort, and plain lie. Politicians, for instance, speak the word democracy with sanctimonious solemnity without the slightest intention of instituting the rule of the people, by the people, and for the people, as our newly elected Prime Minister demonstrated very recently when he reneged on his promise to end the undemocratic first-past-the-post electoral practice and replace it with proportional representation. Why tinker with a comfortable setup which guarantees majority rule with minority support to the Conservatives and the Liberals at alternating sessions, while leaving the real power in the hands of the international corporations that finance and control them? If we used language correctly, we would own up to the fact that we live in a plutocracy, not a democracy. Politicians may lead the way in the perversion of language, but their followers are legion. The mass media have become propaganda machines promoting the agenda of the establishment with shameless verbal trickery designed to conceal the truth from us, and by disinformation to lead us to false conclusions that serve their sole and singular purpose, the maximization of profits. I recommend Manufacturing Consent by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky if you think I'm exaggerating. I dare say most lawyers, journalists, and politicians are honorable women and men, but they are not usually in positions of power. Nowhere is this more evident than in the issues surrounding climate change. Massive disinformation about it has been spread for decades by the media, by politicians, by the PR spin doctors in oil companies and car manufacturers, even by some scientists. The fruit of this perversion of language are the disasters climate change has now begun to visit upon us. And we haven't even talked about the digital media and their negative effects on the use of language, not about the absurd verbal sophistries of religions determined to perpetuate their version of mental infantilism, nor the creeping language fascism implicit in political correctness, nor the systematic militarization of our society by elevating our men and women in uniform to the status of heroes. The recent charade about Vimy Ridge is a perfect example of the abuse of language to manipulate public opinion. Soldiers are trained killers. And I wonder with the American poet E.E. Cummings, why must itself up every of a park anus stick, quote, some, quote, statue, unquote, to prove that a hero equals every jerk who was afraid to answer no. Quote, citizen, quote, might otherwise forget that if, quote, state, unquote, says kill, killing is an act of Christian virtue. The corruption of language goes hand in hand with the corrosion of trust, and trust is the basis of civil society. Without it, a society collapses into a maelstrom of mendacities, falsehoods, and fabrications. By insisting on using language honestly, concretely, correctly, and truthfully, poets become the mainstay of civilization, and that goes a long way towards justifying Shelley's claim that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. But besides employing the right word, there is the manner in which poets use language. The how is as important as the what of speaking when it comes to poetry. Let me give you an example. Here is the poet W.H. Auden telling us about someone taking a stroll one evening in the city of London, England. As I walked out one evening, walking down Bristol Street, the crowds upon the pavement were fields of harvest wheat. And down by the brimming river, I heard a lover sing under an arch of the railway. Love has no ending. I love you, dear, I'll love you till Africa and China meet. I'll love you till the river jumps over the mountain and the salmon sing in the street. I'll love you till the ocean is hung up to dry and the 7 stars go squawking like geese about the sky. The years shall run like rabbits, for in my arms I hold the flower of the ages and the first love of the world. The plain language with which the poem begins belies the experience that is to come, and it is foreshadowed in the iambic rhythm of the line. As I walk out one evening, we hear the walker put one foot ahead of the other, coming up from the startling metaphor of the crowds in the street as fields of harvest wheat. Because we know people are not wheat, the metaphor catapults us into the mind of the person walking down Bristol Street. Fields of harvest wheat suggest fruitfulness, golden light, the affirming promise. Auden involves the reader emotionally in the experience he recounts by inviting them to inject the metaphor with their own personal experience. Thus, they are subtly lured into seeing the world through the eyes of the poem's protagonist. That's how they come upon the lovers, perhaps exchanging caresses in the shadow of the railway bridge. Again, Auden resorts to metaphor. He hears a lover sing. Well, it's highly unlikely that the lovers in the dark underpass actually break into song as they fondle and kiss each other. But the metaphor points to what is happening in the innermost heart of the lovers, the ecstasy of being united in love and the sense of that love lasting forever. That's why the lover sings, "Love has no ending. I love you till China and Africa meet." Even if the Earth's tectonic plates were moving in a way that might reunite Africa and China, the lovers would be sure their love would last a few million years, a few 100 million years indeed. Auden here uses another powerful poetic device, hyperbole. The reader, precisely such an exaggerated statement is not to be taken seriously or literally, that the reader's imagination is challenged and they are drawn into the emotion of the lovers, which reaches a crescendo in the promise that I'll love you till the ocean is folded and hung up to dry. In this heaven-storming image, we are swept up in the emotion of a love that all life on our planet, and we come to feel the yearning for this love to be eternal. The scientifically minded may be inclined to dismiss this sort of language as romantic rubbish. Oceans are not bed sheets to be hung out to dry, yet it is through this combination of rhythm, image, and metaphor that language penetrates the deepest layers of our inner being. Far from attempting to embellish reality romantically, Auden aims at revealing the harsh truth of what it seems to be human, what it means to be human. The persona of the poem on his walk down Bristol Street is suddenly confronted with the mortality of all things. It ambushes him in an abrupt shift of image, tone, and color. I repeat the last stanza. The years shall run like rabbits, for in my arms I hold the flower of the ages and the first love of the world. But all the clocks in the city began to whir and chime. Oh, let not time deceive you. You cannot conquer time. In the burrows of the nightmare where justice naked is, time watches from the shadows and coughs when you would kiss. In headaches and in worries, life vaguely leaks away, and time will have his fancy tomorrow or today. We are face to face now with the brutality of the world. The poet does not lecture us. He plunges us into the river of experience so that we come to feel with our whole being what the mind can conceive of, that the mind can conceive of perfect, timeless states of existence which the flesh cannot deliver. The joy of our yearning is also the source of our sorrow and pain. The poem makes us know and accept the paradox. The triumph of the imagination at once intensifies and mitigates the agony of our mortality and thereby opens the way towards reconciliation. And here it is, at the end of the poem. Oh, look in the mirror. Oh, look in your distress. Life remains a blessing, although you cannot bless. Oh, stand by the window as the tears scald and start. You shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart. It was late in the evening. The lovers, they were gone. The clocks had ceased their chiming, and the deep river ran on. What an evening walk by the Thames, eh? We have traveled the emotional heights and lows of human beings and found solace in knowing that our bliss and suffering is forever shared and forever all your own, to quote Thomas again. This poem has liberated us from suppressed emotions about the tragedy at the core of existence. The reader is receptive now for the crucial insight that love and life are a blessing, even though our hearts are crooked. And we are not a blessing on the world. With our spirits lifted and enriched, we are able to continue on our arduous path with a lighter heart and a more serene spirit as the deep river of time runs on. In the age of science, such emotional and mental reassurance is more important than ever. Over the past century or two, science has flung open windows that have provided us with mind-boggling vistas of the universe and with astounding insight into its complexities. The scientific method of investigating our world has yielded much that is beautiful and awe-inspiring, but just as much that is terrifying. The pretty night sky with its myriad stars, for instance, turns out to be an incomprehensibly vast, empty space with temperatures close to absolute zero, and the stars are not the twinkling little lanterns of our nursery, but a bunch of gigantic nuclear holocausts that, if you came within 1 million miles of any of them, would instantly incinerate you. As if that weren't enough, we learn that each of us is a walking community of around 100 trillion microbes, that our great-great-great-grandparents a few million generations ago were worms, and that dung beetles and bullfrogs are our cousins, that the species Homo sapiens itself will vanish in short order, just as more than 99% of all life forms that ever existed on Earth have become extinct or have evolved into other forms that no longer resemble their ancient kin. As we walk through the lovely tranquility of an autumnal forest, science tells us we're actually wading through a murderous battlefield where all animals and plants are ready to kill each other mercilessly in obedience to nature's existential command: eat and be eaten. Our whole planet is a recycling plant. If you have ears to hear, they'd be filled with the cries of the victims too small for you to see, being crushed and mashed or impaled in their hiding places under the bark of your beautiful maple tree, or speared in the canopy by a passing bird. Nature conducts what Thomas Hobbes called a bellum omnium contra omnes, a war of everybody against everybody. And this wholesale butchery takes place continuously on a speck of dust we call Earth, spinning around one of 100 billion stars, a mediocre one, in an odd corner of one of 100 billion galaxies, and all of them flying apart at rapidly increasing speeds, heading for extinction. And this whole spectacular charade has neither sense, nor meaning, nor purpose. Such is the reality of the world that science has discovered or uncovered. If you don't find this demoralizing and terrifying, you haven't woken up yet. Perhaps the first and most shocking blow was dealt our psyche by Charles Darwin, who pricked the balloon of our delusions of grandeur by showing how all life evolves by the merciless process of natural selection. His insights ushered in a somber fin de siècle pessimism in Europe, as foreshadowed in Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach, written less than 10 years after the publication of The Origin of Species. Ah, love, let us be true to one another. For the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, has neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Since then, relativity and quantum mechanics have further dehumanized the world that we live in. The scientist's grim picture of reality amounts to a kind of knowledge terrorism. And since the grimness is endemic, fright and flight have become permanent features of our times. Charlatans and swindlers, obsessed with the pursuit of power and money, take advantage of it, while ordinary people live in permanent fear of nuclear war and environmental catastrophe, to say nothing of earthquakes, volcanoes, and asteroids. Since neither individual life nor the universe have any meaning, people no longer know who they are or what they should do. Our educational institutions are at sixes and sevenths about what to prepare young people for. A growing number, especially of young people, resort to drugs to escape reality. A whole industry of escapism has grown up that engulfs us all 24 hours a day. TV, theatrics, and hype, hysterical onlooker sports events, mindless global tourism. Everyone is running away from the truth. The final escape is suicide, and suicide rates are rising. But painful and tragic contradictions will always be part of our short journey here on Earth, and there is no getting away from them. Space travel and emigration to planet Mars won't solve our problems. Our despair will be waiting to welcome us as we touch down at the landing site. Science makes us aware of our irrelevancies to the universe and thereby contributes to our dilemma. It operates analytically and rationally, whereas human beings live and think emotionally. In the 18th century, the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus, in a gesture of taxonomic self-aggrandizement, named human beings Homo sapiens. Now, sapientia in Latin is wisdom. Can you really call an animal wise that engages perpetually in episodes of mutual slaughter and celebrates them as heroic? And can a species be called wise that knowingly destroys, as we are blithely doing today, the habitat on which its survival depends? Would not Homo stupidus be a more appropriate taxonomic designation for us? We are not an animal rationale, notwithstanding René Descartes' dictum cogito ergo sum. The human genome differs from that of a chimpanzee by about 1.2% of our DNA. In other words, we are 98.9% animal, and like animals, we are driven by instinct and emotion. We rationalize what we do after the fact. At best, we are an animal rationale. Our adrenaline system, which catapults us into instant postures of defense and aggression when faced with concrete threats, remains inert to rational arguments or threats of catastrophe projected to overwhelm us in the future. Only when the inhabitants of the world's cities are wading in water above their hips will their adrenaline response be triggered, and then it will be too late to arrest climate change. So what is to be done? Well, political practices have to become truly democratic, economic systems fair and equitable, and the barbarous pursuit of money has to be replaced by values befitting a civilized, cultured society. How do we achieve that? There are a growing number of voices around the globe demanding we move in that direction. But for them to reach a critical mass that will tip the scales, we need to move beyond the flight response and conquer our existential angst and hopelessness. We must accept that ultimately reality is beyond our control and learn to incorporate its vastness, complexity, incomprehensibility, and indifference in our lives. Reconciliation with the brutal facts of the universe and recovery of hope in the face of them cannot be accomplished with theories and arguments alone. This is why we need poetry. A poem addresses the reader in the totality of his or her being, mind, heart, guts, and pimples. Its strategies serve the creation of a total experience in which the ambiguities, contradictions, and paradoxes of the world are reconciled. In its synthesis of the heterogeneous, the poem makes the reader whole again. A poem does not argue, it embodies truth and imparts emotional solace and security to the reader willing to give it the attention and the intimacy of a lover. In poetry, the experience of transitoriness, fragility, and uncertainty are not a source of gloom, but a force of affirmation. It transcends despair to make us know how precious life is and how glorious the world. In the experience of a poem, to quote Yeats again, all is changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. It is similar to a near-death experience, from which people often emerge with a heightened sense of the joys and splendors of existence. In this holistic state, the mind can find new meaning in life, bringing reason into harmony with our sensations and emotions. Poetry cannot save humanity, For one thing, not all poems embody the complex truth of human existence. For another, music and painting, too, address us as primarily emotional beings. All the arts offer us the experience of a world both glorious and sorrowful, meaningless and fulfilling. But poetry includes what is most human about us, language. Language honed to clarity and integrity. A society that neglects and degrades poetry will inevitably plunge into a state of chaos and despair, because the irresolvable contradictions of the world will overwhelm its people. Once upon a time, religion enabled people to endure and be reconciled to the miseries of life. It did so by engaging the arts in promoting its dogmas. Imagine a family of literal peasants in the Middle Ages, leaving their stinking straw-thatched cottage, often shared with cows and pigs, to attend church on Sunday morning. Titanic Gothic architecture raised their eyes to heaven. Burning candles and intoxicating incense filled a vast, mysterious space illumined by stained glass windows and adorned with colorful paintings and icons. Then the reading of scriptures, the singing of hymns, and the participation in various rituals shared by the community of their neighbors. All this conveyed a sense of the sacred and raised their spirits from the suffering of their daily lives to the knowledge of a greater glory. Now, the age of supernatural deities and their nursery tales about creation and life after death is over and done with. The majority of people in the Western world no longer believe in an almighty God, though they continue with quasi-religious practices because of the emotional security and solace they derive from their community. As the Ottawa Unitarian congregation puts it, we come together to nurture meaning, hope, and reverence for the earth. In the search for meaning and the nurture of hope, the arts play a central role, and humanists would do well to include them in a meaningful way in their program if they ever want to become a global movement and not just a debating society. With its uncompromising pursuit of truth, science plays a central role in the new civilization that will rise from the ruins of ours. It deprives us of the comforts of illusions, but it also offers us models of the universe that are more exciting, more magnificent than anything anyone could ever have imagined, even a couple of centuries ago. The tales religions tell pale by the side of the stories scientists tell about evolution, black holes, relativity, quantum mechanics, and multi-universe. The work of true poets must employ today the creative ambiguity of a poem to embody the discoveries of modern science in our experience of nature. Lack of understanding scientific models of reality is no excuse for failing to do so. In recent decades, a number of distinguished scientists have made it their business to communicate the advances in their field to us amateurs at a level that respects both the integrity of their disciplines and the intelligence of their readers. Their dedication and enthusiasm have made it possible for us to join them in their imaginative pursuit of the secrets of the world. We are indeed fortunate to have two of them with us today and tomorrow. Richard Dawkins, I don't know whether he's here now. And Lawrence Krauss. And we're all looking forward to what they are going to share with us. When they do, they will no doubt borrow some of the strategies poets use. Much scientific calculation is of such enormity that the imagination can only grasp it in a simile. When Richard Dawkins, who speaks of the, quote, poetic magic of reality, unquote, in one of his books, The Magic of Reality, explains that if we imagine a proton nucleus of the crystal diamond atom to be a soccer ball, the electrons circling it at a distance of several kilometers are smaller than gnats. And the nucleus of the nearest neighboring atom is 15 kilometers away. We begin to get a sense of what scientists mean by empty space. There's a profound kinship between scientists and poets, and in their attempts to understand reality. Starting in the imagination, they both pursue a different but legitimate path of knowing. Scientists, like poets, start their search by asking, what if, followed by an imaginative proposition, what would happen to light if space were curved, for instance. From there, they develop a hypothesis. They then put the test to experimentation and observation before it is accepted as true. We need to be circumspect with the word truth. How reliable is scientific truth when, in fact, 95% of reality is dark matter and dark energy? The darkness surely is in our brains, not in the world around us. Why should it surprise us, considering that all verification is dependent on a set of 5 senses that evolved over billions of years to serve the bearer in the battle to survive and reproduce? Einstein himself compared the scientist to, quote, a man trying to understand the mechanism of a closed watch. He may never be quite sure if his picture of the inner workings of the watch is the only one which could explain his observations, because, quote, he will never be able to compare his picture with the real mechanism. This matter is, of course, even worse when we learn from Richard Dawkins that the watchmaker was blind. To be sure, the scientific method in which reason aligns itself with experiment and observation is the only way we know to formulate verifiable explanations of natural phenomena. Uncertain as we shall remain, something fundamental in our scientific theories must be correct for us to have achieved, for instance, the spectacular feat of landing the Shoemaker space probe on the asteroid 433 Eros in 2001, as it was hurtling through interstellar space at 25 kilometers per second, about 50 million kilometers away from Earth. Our technological advances have now made it reasonable to imagine a future human civilization in which most of our dreams come true. To achieve it, however, we had better grow up in a hurry. That became clear to me on December 21st, 1968, when I heard the crew of Apollo 8 read from the book of Genesis as they orbited the moon. We are emotionally, and too many are mentally, at the kindergarten stage. Yet our toys are the product of the most advanced minds of the species and include nuclear weapons. Is it any wonder that we are collectively frightened? The arts and sciences must join forces to show that there is more to celebrate than to lament in this cruel but glorious world. Scientists can do this by exposing us to models that demonstrate the magic beauty of reality. Poets do it by making us experience the bittersweet paradoxy of the world and thereby reconciling us to it emotionally. As mature beings, we can then open our minds and rejoice in the many different dimensions of reality. We may even derive a meaning for human existence from the explorations of scientists and poets, and come to see life as a journey of the mind in pursuit of comprehension and compassion. That exciting journey may never end, because we may never get to know the truth. For that, we may need a mutation of our brains that provide us with a couple of extra senses by which to perceive and examine dimensions of the universe we can now only speculate about. Such an evolutionary advance might take 100 million years, more or less. In the meantime, we may as well do the best we have. Use words to point to what cannot be said. A true poem takes the reader to the edge of what language can say, points silently at the dark center of the mystery at the heart of all that exists, and creates a moment of truth from which we emerge with a heightened sense of the joys and splendors of existence. This is what I understand Shelley to be saying when he calls upon poets to draw into a certain propinquity with the beautiful and the true, the partial apprehension of the agencies of the invisible world. Let me, if I have the time, let me illustrate the point with a poem from my collection Fugitive Horizons, which, according to the blurb on the back cover, takes the reader on a mind-blowing journey across the known micro and macrocosm to the extreme outer edges of space and time. Here it is, something to talk about. I've been telling you for over 400 years the stars don't turn around you. They turn you around. And still you're giving every day the lie, calling dawn sunrise and nightfall sunset. I know you can't see straight, but I thought it was because light is bent, not because you're at your wit's end. You want more proof? Thank your lucky stars you don't feel the headwind as you're spun around this topsy-turvy stellar carousel. At a galactic speed of well over 500,000 miles per hour, it'd blow you away. Then you'd have something to talk about. Enjoy a walk in the forest instead. Smell the cedars, listen to the waxwings and warblers, watch the deer, touch the moss. You're moving in at least 4 different directions at once. One of them will take you right back to where you started. Thank you.